The world is the stage is a world of entertainment.
The musical has perhaps one of the most notable histories of any genre in Hollywood, coming from humble beginnings during the early years of sound film to one of the most popular and well-liked genres during the golden age of Hollywood, to box office poison almost overnight in the late 60s, to the point that it's never recovered, and successful entries in the genre are much more the exception than the rule. The musical might just have the biggest fall from grace of any genre out there. But despite that, the movie musical did have a lot to offer, and still does for those who are willing to give it a chance. And today, I'd like to go over the classic musicals from the golden age of Hollywood and explain why they should be more appreciated, and maybe even make a comeback of sorts. And there will be spoilers for a few of the movies I bring up ahead, so in case there's something you would like to see and don't want to know what happens, you should probably remain on the lookout. I won't be giving out any other spoiler warnings in this video. Okay, so as I just briefly touched on, when sound movies were still in their infancy, the musical had a lot of trouble finding its footing since many directors found it nearly impossible to work with sound, so the prospect of having to deal with both music and singing was not an appealing one for most. So as a result, musicals stuck mostly to Broadway and other stage shows until 1933, when Warner Brothers released the now classic 42nd Street. Considered by many experts to be the first true musical ever put on film, the movie was a huge success with audiences and quickly paved the way for many other classics of the genre to be released in the following years. Whether they were adaptations of famous plays, such as the 1936 version of Showboat, or original stories made specifically for the screen, like many of the musicals starring Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. And this early success would continue for about the next 30 years, with MGM proving to be the king of the musical in the 1940s and 50s in particular, and usually found their biggest successes when working in the genre. Some of the most notable movie stars of that time were even ones that starred in various musicals. Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland even became the king and queen of the box office at different times when they were paired in a bunch of musicals starring as kids performing their way to success. And to this day, Garland remains one of the most famous stars of her era because of the musicals she appeared in, with her most famous obviously being The Wizard of Oz, but which also includes other notable movies such as the Christmas staple Meet Me in St. Louis. And many other stars and performers found their greatest successes in musicals, be they singers who got to prove their acting talents such as Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, or Doris Day, or even great music composers who created some of their best songs specifically for film, which naturally includes the likes of Irving Berlin, Cole Porter, and the immortal Rodgers and Hammerstein. To put it simply, musicals of the golden age of Hollywood were often filled to the brim with talent both in front of and behind the camera, to the point that even when a specific musical wasn't very well made, the talent involved was often enough to still elevate it. And in a similar vein, certain performers who specialized in areas outside of acting only got to display their talents for future generations to see in musicals. Now, one would naturally think of band leaders such as Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, or Paul Whiteman, but this did include other types of performers as well. For example, Joan McCracken, who in her time was heavily acclaimed for her dancing abilities, but these days is most known for being the second wife of famed choreographer and director Bob Fosse, only got to really display her dancing abilities in a few films, with the most notable being the 1947 musical Good News, and specifically the show-stopping number Pass That Peace Pipe. And not only does McCracken manage to steal pretty much the entire movie with that one musical number, but it's really a marvel unto itself, probably being among the most extensively choreographed of the whole decade. Or for an even more extreme example, famed Broadway star Katharine Cornell was famously very reluctant to go into movies and dedicated her entire life to performing on the stage. The one exception, however, was when she agreed to make a cameo as herself in the musical Stage Door Canteen, and that remains among the only footage of her acting that still survives to this day. And, of course, there are also acclaimed singers such as the likes of Lourdes McGuire, and please forgive me if I'm not pronouncing that right, who preferred performing opera on stage but was persuaded to act in a couple of musicals and proved to actually be pretty funny in them as a result. And there's also Mario Lanza, who even today is considered one of the best singers of his kind to have ever lived, and got to display his remarkable singing talents in quite a few musicals before his untimely death, with one of the most notable being the 1954 musical The Student Prince, which is actually said to contain some of his best work ever, in films or otherwise. And that was another impressive thing about musicals, the fact that they often brought out talents in people you wouldn't expect. For example, in the musical Born to Dance, Cole Porter insisted that James Stewart do his own singing, and actually proves to be better than most would expect. Or in the musical High Society, which is just jam-packed full of musical talent and legendary duets, and Grace Kelly of all people proves to not only have a singing voice that could gel with the likes of Bing Crosby, but also proves to have excellent comedic chops rarely seen of her when her character gets drunk at her engagement party. Heck, even Marlon Brando proved to have a pretty decent singing voice when performing alongside Frank Sinatra in Guys and Dolls. But this also applied just as much to showcasing more unconventional talents that you'd rarely be able to see in an unconventional film as well, such as famed ice skater Sonja Henie, who not only won 3 gold medals in the Olympics, but also got to display her incredible talents in a series of musicals, with perhaps the most notable among them being 1940's Sun Valley Serenade. Or Esther Williams, who was a professional swimmer by trade but actually found her biggest success starring in a bunch of MGM musicals that often went out of their way to showcase the full range of her abilities, to the point that she actually helped popularize swimming as a professional sport in the United States and introduced the song Baby It's Cold Outside. Now, at this point you might be wondering what exactly I'm getting at here. That musicals were not only one of the most popular genres of the golden age of Hollywood, but often helped showcase performers with unique abilities that would be hard to put on display any other way, be they singing or otherwise, but also tended to provide the chance for audiences to see normal, regular actors in a different light as well. And for just one example of that, both James Cagney and Rita Hayworth are most well known today for their dramatic roles, but many would be surprised to learn that not only were they great dancers, but both actually preferred doing musicals to gangster movies at that. Though that does actually make sense, considering Hayworth grew up dancing, and Cagney started his career in the last days of vaudeville, where singing and dancing were very valuable talents, and the musical's ability to take unconventional performers and effortlessly place them and their talents into any given movie helped make an already unique genre even more fascinating to sit down and watch, because when done right, they often provided an experience unlike any other for both audiences and the people in them alike. But there is another, more understated reason why audiences took to them so hard during their time, and this mainly comes down to the fact that musicals were often very wholesome, idealistic, and generally as feel-good as a movie could get. And especially in the early years of the musical's popularity in the late 1930s and early 1940s, when the world was seemingly in a never-ending state of turmoil and the future seemed as uncertain as ever, musicals proved to be a heavy source of comfort for a lot of people. As I even brought up in another video, which you can find a link in the description to, audiences specifically flocked to movies in the early 40s that depicted the Pacific Islands as a place of paradise rather than plagued by death and war like they actually were, because at that point, that's what they wanted to see. They wanted to believe that such places could actually exist and be real at a time when there was war or the threat of it even in the most remote places on Earth. And the same year, it was a musical that produced one of the most famous and successful songs of all time, White Christmas. And though the biggest reason for its success by a long shot was because of how well it captured the feelings of nostalgic longing that many war-weary soldiers felt, that still doesn't change the fact that the musical Holiday Inn is the reason for the song's existence, as well as gave us one of the only pairings you'll ever see between the likes of Bing Crosby and Fred Astaire. But as you probably already know, that sentiment continued long after the war was over, with White Christmas not only being the highest-grossing movie of 1954, but many great film composers found their greatest success in that decade too. Because if the 1930s and 40s were more about simple musicals, the 50s and 60s gave rise to the epic musical, and the results were some of the best ever put on film, or anywhere else for that matter. But once again, the reason for their continued success was because they contained sentiments that people wanted to see. At that point, they craved movies that made them feel better about the world and would leave them feeling more optimistic about life and what it has to offer. Now, sure, there were musicals that didn't have such a cheery outlook, with 1962's Gypsy probably being a good example of that, as the lead is essentially the villain of the story, and the hero ends up finding success as a stripper. But on the whole, that's what the musical represented: humanity and the world around it at its absolute best. And a major reason they fell out of favor in the late 60s is because people no longer wanted to see such cheery and idealistic films anymore, and craved more gritty and realistic fare, which would give rise to the gangster and psychological dramas of the 1970s. And considering the late 60s contained such things as Vietnam, the Civil Rights Movement, and the infamous Sharon Tate murders, who can really blame people for becoming more cynical and world-weary? In other words, the musical ended up losing its appeal because people no longer believed in the sentiments they were preaching, as their outlook on the world had soured. And as that outlook has only gotten worse, it's really no wonder why the musical has never been able to make a comeback. But at the same time, musical-type films might be exactly the kind of thing people need these days, to help remind them that the world can be a great place to live in. Everybody knows the 1969 musical Hello, Dolly because of the songs featured in WALL-E, specifically Put On Your Sunday Clothes and It Only Takes a Moment. But what a lot of people don't know is that during the latter song, at one point he has this to say:
"Isn't the world full of wonderful things?"
And yet, in the context of the story, he's at his absolute lowest point, but he's accepted that he might have to dig ditches for the rest of his life because he went out and had a great day and fell in love. And his sentiments are so sincere that it ends up rubbing off on the object of his affection and culminates in the moment everybody knows from WALL-E, where they join hands and declare their love. Now, that might be too sentimental and saccharine for some people, and that's fine, but stuff like that does appeal to people more than they'd like to admit. They like seeing somebody who can be happy despite the odds and manage to come out on top with a big smile on their face the whole way through. People want to believe that the world can be a great place to live in, and with musicals being able to express that by having everybody start singing and dancing a happy tune, manage to capture those feelings better than most. That's even the reason most children's movies are musicals, because the songs make it a lot easier to immerse the children in the sentiments that are being expressed. But at the same time, that's also a common criticism against musicals, specifically that the characters break out into song for no reason, and that the overly sentimental atmosphere usually leads to a happy ending whether it fits the story or not. And when done wrong, this is most definitely true. Because what's easy to forget is that not just any story can make for a good musical, no matter how great the songs are. It has to have the right tone for the songs to be able to work. And similarly, when written badly, it can indeed result in the ending being inappropriate for the story being told. But the same is honestly true of any film genre. Once again, it's all about accommodating for both the story and the songs that'll be sung in it. Like, for example, the 1932 novel State Fair is about two naive siblings who go to the titular fair with their family, only to fall in love and have their hearts broken by the time it's over. Because in the end, the novel is the dark story of naive youth being swept up in the glamour of temptation and then being forced to grow up too soon as a result of it. But when Oscar Hammerstein made the book into a musical in 1945, he changed the story to better suit his sentiments, not only borrowing heavily from the 1933 version in the process, but also improving on it at that. Because he doesn't just take the story of the book and add songs and a happy ending to it. He changes the entire tone in order to suit the lighter take he's going for. In other words, instead of being a dark coming-of-age drama, the film becomes a more typical musical about a family full of restless people getting the thrill and excitement they need from the fair, and turning out better off for it as a result. But where the biggest change from page to screen occurs is in the female lead, Margie. Because in the book, she openly admits that she doesn't love the man she plans to marry, but loves his life, and thus chooses to go back to him instead of the journalist she's fallen for, because she'd rather live a life she loves with a man she doesn't, rather than an uncomfortable one with a man she does love. But in the movie, she's changed into somebody who loves to travel and finds the old-fashioned endearing, whereas the man she plans to marry wants to stay on his farm and modernize it. So as a result, it makes a lot more sense in this version of the story that she would choose the traveling journalist over him, because not only does she love him, but she also loves his lifestyle as well. So once again, in this case the lighter tone and happy ending are actually justified and warranted because Oscar Hammerstein put in the work to make it that way. It's appropriate for the story he's trying to tell, regardless of whether or not one thinks the book story is better. And honestly, more musicals from the golden age of Hollywood actually did that than most would believe. Their light tones and penchant for seeing the best in the world were often very justified by the narrative, and not there just for its own sake. They often told the stories of people not in the best position overall, but through perseverance, optimism, and sometimes a little wisdom, usually managed to come out on top. And once again, no matter how much people don't want to admit it, that is a sentiment many like seeing, especially because they could often see themselves in the lead characters. Whether it was a more dignified gentleman like Fred Astaire, or a happy-go-lucky everyman like Gene Kelly, or the determined sort like Ginger Rogers, or just a normal person trying to find their way in the world like countless other talented performers of the day, people could relate to these characters and usually felt their struggles, triumphs, and ultimately their optimism and positivity through them. Even when the story existed to serve the musical numbers rather than the other way around, the people behind these movies often knew what they were doing well enough to get all of that across anyway. But I already got into that specifically where Gene Kelly was concerned in another video, which you can also find a link in the description too in case you're curious. So the point here is, if there is any genre of film that should make a comeback in the modern era, it's the musical. Because as I just dedicated the whole video to pointing out, it always had a ton of worth. They served their time period and the performers in them very well, and could probably do the same today if just given a chance. They could even help solve the common problem of trying to come up with original stories, because in certain musicals, it's not really about the plot and centered more around the music anyway. So a story that wouldn't be long enough for feature length could benefit from being turned into a musical, because that way the songs could fill out the time the story can't, while still entertaining the audience, as long as it was done competently. Because as I said before, not just any movie can be a musical, it has to be suited for it. And ultimately, they could help people regain a more positive outlook on life. Sure, maybe it isn't always realistic, but does it really need to be? As I pointed out in my video on classic literature, which you can also find a link in the description too, some of the best stories out there are ones that deviated the most from reality, and the musical is really no exception to that. It doesn't need to be dark or gritty in order to say something important. Sometimes, simply saying that life can be great, even when it isn't going great for you personally, is the most important message of all. A mentality like that has saved many a person from complete despair, and the musical has those feelings down to a T. Now, a common counter-argument to all of this is that modern society has become way too cynical to accept something as optimistic and upbeat as a classic Hollywood musical. But considering movies like Singing in the Rain, or the works of Rodgers and Hammerstein like The Sound of Music are still so well known and have lasting appeal even today, maybe audiences would welcome them more than some realize. But even if that isn't the case and rapid cynicism is truly to blame, then that's exactly why such optimistic movies are needed, to remind people of the better things in life and not to focus on the negative and darker aspects of reality all the time. Because if people could admit back then, from the 1930s to the 60s, when the world was plagued by disease, war, depression, uncertainty about the future, massive civil unrest, and poverty, that the world still has a lot to offer and is a pretty nice place to live in, shouldn't we, who for all intents and purposes live in a much more ideal society, be able to... Okay, I think I've more than made my point. And if you're still here, thank you for sticking it out for so long. But now I'd like to hear your opinions. Do you think that the classic musicals from the golden age of Hollywood not only have a lot of worth, but could stand to make a comeback in a more talent-starved and jaded society? Or do you believe that their sentiments are outdated and they were better off dying out? Please let me know in the comments. And please remember that you don't have to agree with any opinions or sentiments expressed in this video. You are entitled to your own opinion on anything discussed here, and if you think I had musicals or anything else completely wrong, that is perfectly okay. And thank you all for watching. It is all greatly appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.